The biggest problem with Pattaya Walking Street isn't what happens there. It's what people think happens there. Some people will tell you it's dead, others will tell you it's dangerous. Others think it's nothing more than a giant tourist trap filled with scams. The reality is a lot more complicated than that. Over the years, Walking Street has evolved, changed, survived major disruptions, and constantly reinvented itself. Yet many of the opinions you hear today are based on outdated information, secondhand stories, or experiences from years ago. Depending on who you ask, Pattaya Walking Street is either dead, dangerous, full of scams, or the greatest nightlife destination on Earth. The funny thing is that many people repeating those opinions haven't actually been there recently. So today, I'm breaking down the 5 biggest lies about Pattaya Walking Street from the perspective of someone who has spent years exploring nightlife across Southeast Asia. You might agree with some of these. You might completely disagree with others. That's perfectly fine. Stay until the end because the bonus myth might actually be the biggest misconception of them all. But first, let's talk about why 2 people can visit the exact same walking street and leave with completely different opinions about it. Before we get into the lies themselves, there's one thing you need to understand about Walking Street. This street never really stands still. Venues change names, sometimes only the owners change. Sometimes the concept changes completely. Places open, places close, and what's popular today might be forgotten 2 years from now, or 2 months. That's why you can hear 2 completely different stories about the exact same walking street. One guy visited 10 years ago and still talks about the good old days, usually after his 3rd beer. Another visited last month and thinks it's the greatest nightlife street in Thailand. And somewhere in between you'll find people who absolutely hate it. The funny thing is that they're all talking about the same street. Walking Street is probably one of the most famous nightlife streets in Southeast Asia. But depending on when you visited, who you met, and what you were looking for, your experience can be completely different. And that's exactly why so many strong opinions exist about it. Before we continue, what's the biggest claim you've ever heard about Walking Street? Let me know in the comments. Now let's start with the lie that has probably been repeated more than any other. Let's start with the claim I probably hear more than any other. Walking Street is dead. Honestly, I don't think there's a single nightlife destination in Southeast Asia where I haven't heard some version of that sentence. It's dead. It's finished. You should have been here 15 years ago. You're too late. And look, I understand where some of that comes from. People get nostalgic. They remember a particular time, a particular venue, a particular atmosphere, and naturally compare everything today against their favorite memories. The problem is that nothing stays the same forever. Not Walking Street, not Pattaya, not Bangkok, not even the places people call the good old days. Yes, Walking Street has changed. Some legendary venues disappeared. Some changed owners. Others completely reinvented themselves. The clientele mix evolved. COVID hit hard. Various regulations and crackdowns changed parts of the nightlife scene. But different doesn't automatically mean dead. Because if you actually walk down Walking Street on a busy weekend night, you'll still see thousands of people, packed venues, street performers, restaurants, clubs, bars, live music, and one of the busiest nightlife areas anywhere in Southeast Asia. What many people are really saying when they call Walking Street dead is that it's not the same as the version they remember. And that's fair, but that's a very different statement. The honest reality? Walking Street adapted, it evolved, it followed new trends, and chances are a year from now it will be different again. And whether you personally think that's for better or worse, it's very hard to argue that it's dead. Because every weekend, the street tells a very different story. Now let's move on to the second myth, one that scares a lot of first-time visitors before they even arrive in Pattaya. Walking Street is dangerous. This is probably the myth that scares first-time visitors the most. Before they even arrive in Pattaya, they've already seen the headlines, travel warnings, Reddit horror stories, or that one viral video showing a fight on Walking Street. And look, I understand where that comes from. Every now and then something happens. A fight breaks out, a tourist gets into trouble, a video goes viral. But the reason those incidents get so much attention is because they're the exception, not the rule. The reality is that Walking Street is one of the busiest tourist areas in Thailand. Every night, thousands of people walk through it without any issues. It's crowded, brightly lit, and has a visible police presence. From my own experience, a little common sense goes a very long way here, even if you're traveling solo, like I usually am. Are there risks? Of course. Just like there are in Bangkok, Manila, Phnom Penh, or pretty much any nightlife district anywhere in the world. But calling Walking Street dangerous is a huge exaggeration. Now let's move on to the next myth. Because according to some people, Walking Street is only for one very specific type of visitor. It's only for dirty old men. This one always makes me smile. Because according to the internet, the moment you step onto Walking Street, you instantly transform into a 70-year-old retiree wearing sandals and complaining that things were better 20 years ago. The reality is a little more complicated. Yes, that crowd exists. Actually, every age group is represented here. Spend 10 minutes walking down the street and you'll see couples taking photos, groups of friends looking for a place to party, tourists trying seafood, people heading to nightclubs, and plenty of visitors who are simply curious to see what Walking Street is all about. That's because Walking Street isn't one venue. It's an entire street filled with different experiences. You have seafood restaurants, live music venues, bars, clubs like Insomnia, Mist, and Republic, street performers, and people who never spend a single baht on nightlife, but still come here just to experience the atmosphere. The funny thing is that many people who criticize Walking Street have never actually been there. They've already decided what kind of people must visit it. And before you call anyone old, just remember that if everything goes according to plan, you'll get there one day too, hopefully. So the reality here is usually very different from what people imagine. Now let's move on to another myth, one that sounds great until you actually start spending money. This one catches a lot of people by surprise. Because somewhere along the way, Pattaya earned a reputation for being significantly cheaper than Bangkok. And in some cases, that's absolutely true. The problem is that people often confuse Pattaya with Walking Street. Those are not the same thing. If you're spending your evenings around Soi Buakau, local bars, food markets, or many of Pattaya's nightlife areas, you'll often find prices that are lower than what you'd expect in Bangkok. But Walking Street? That's a different story. This is one of the most famous tourist streets in Thailand. The tourist premium is very much alive here. Drink prices are similar to Bangkok. Some clubs are comparable. Some are even more expensive. Especially when you step into some of the most popular venues. You might be surprised when the bill arrives. Some of these places can easily end up costing more than a night in Nana Plaza. You've been warned. So if you arrive expecting Walking Street to cost half as much as Bangkok, there's a decent chance you'll be unpleasantly surprised. The honest answer? Some things are cheaper, some things cost about the same, and some things are actually more expensive. Pattaya can absolutely be a budget-friendly destination. Walking Street just isn't where most people go to save money. And now we get to the myth that probably causes the most anxiety for tourists before they visit. Everything is a scam. If you want to completely avoid scams on Walking Street, I have a simple solution for you. Don't go there. Actually, don't travel at all. It's a bit like saying you want to avoid food poisoning, so you stop eating. Problem solved. The reality is that not everything people call a scam is actually a scam. Sometimes it's a scam. Sometimes it's tourist pricing. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding. And sometimes it's simply a bad decision made after a few drinks. Now don't get me wrong, bill padding exists, overcharging exists, questionable venues exist. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That's exactly why we keep track of places worth visiting, places worth avoiding, and changes happening on the ground inside the Lazy Nomad Telegram community. But the idea that every venue on Walking Street is trying to rip you off simply isn't true. Most businesses here operate exactly like businesses anywhere else. They're here to make money. The more money they convince you to spend, the happier they'll be. That's not a scam. That's business. The biggest mistake I see is people forgetting that simple fact. A little common sense goes a very long way here. And honestly, that's true for almost every nightlife district in the world. So no, everything on Walking Street is not a scam. But if somebody promises you unlimited fun, zero risk, and no chance of making a bad decision, now that's starting to sound like a scam. And before we finish, let's talk about the biggest myth of them all. And now for the bonus myth. Walking Street is the best nightlife Pattaya has to offer. My answer? Not even close. Now before the Walking Street fans grab their pitchforks, hear me out. Walking Street is iconic, it's famous, it's fun, and if it's your first time in Pattaya, I absolutely think you should visit it. But the longer you spend in Pattaya, the more likely you are to discover that the city has a lot more to offer. Personally, if I had to choose where to spend a night out, I'd probably pick LK Metro over Walking Street. Then there is Soi Buakaw, Soi Boomerang, Tree Town, and yes, even the infamous Soi 6. Different crowds, different atmosphere, different prices, different experiences. And that's really the point. The best nightlife area in Pattaya depends entirely on what you're looking for. Walking Street gets 90% of the attention, but Pattaya nightlife is much bigger than one street. In fact, many long-term visitors eventually spend more time outside Walking Street than on it. The funny thing is that many visitors spend years talking about Pattaya, while never really leaving Walking Street. And that's one of the reasons the VIP Lazy Nomad Club exists. Not just to talk about Walking Street, but to share recommendations, updates, experiences, stories, hidden gems, and places that most tourists never discover on their own. Not just Pattaya, all across Southeast Asia. Because the biggest mistake you can make in Pattaya isn't visiting Walking Street. It's thinking that Walking Street is all Pattaya has to offer. So there you have it. Walking Street isn't dead. It's not nearly as dangerous as some people make it sound. It's not only for dirty old men. It's not automatically cheaper than Bangkok. And no, not everything is a scam. And that's probably why the arguments about Walking Street never seem to end. Walking Street is neither as amazing nor as terrible as its biggest fans and biggest critics often claim. The reality, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. But now I'm curious, which of these lies do you agree with? Which ones do you completely disagree with? And what myth about Walking Street did I miss? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely interested to hear your take. And if you're planning a trip to Pattaya and want a complete breakdown of Walking Street, how it's structured, what venues you'll find there, and what to expect, check out my full Walking Street guide linked below. If you enjoy honest, no BS guides to nightlife and travel across Southeast Asia, consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for tagging along with Lazy Nomad. Until our paths cross again in the neon-lit streets of Southeast Asia, keep exploring, but always keep it lazy. Good night, and see you on the next adventure.